We're one of the organizations that is here today to announce the release of the Expose and Close reports, exposing 10 of the country's worst detention centers, immigration detention facilities, including 2 here in Texas. Many people know, but many people don't know, that the immigration system in the United States has grown dramatically over the last 15 years. Now, there are more than 34,000 people who are detained on any given day, and more than 400,000 people will pass through the immigration detention system this year. President Obama made some promises to reform this inhumane system back in 2009, but appalling conditions in immigration detention remain the norm, including immigrants being subject to punitive treatment, inadequate medical care, vulnerable to rape and assault, and isolated from legal assistance and often from their family members. People in immigration detention include long-standing members of our communities, they include asylum seekers, and they include legal permanent residents convicted of only minor crimes. And while immigrants suffer and taxpayers foot the bill, private prison corporations are getting rich off of this system of immigrant incarceration. So today we're here as members of Texas's civil rights and faith communities to say that it's time for real change and to close some of the worst of the immigrant detention centers around our state. We're going to have 4 speakers today. The first is going to be Sam Bong from Texans United for Families. Sam is one of the primary authors of the 2 reports on the detention system here in Texas.
I'm also a resident of Texas, a concerned citizen, and a member of Texans United for Families, which is a coalition of advocacy groups working to end immigration detention in Texas. I prepared a statement that I'd like to share with you today. So in July of this year, 4 colleagues and I conducted a tour of the Houston Processing Center and the Polk County Detention Facility. There we found immigrants being housed in prison-like conditions that violated the basic human decency. The Polk facility in particular was the worst of the 2. In the tour, we found that men are confined to small, dark cells with 8 other men for anywhere from 20 to 23 hours a day. The cells lacked natural lighting, are dark and dreary, and don't provide much in the way of free movement or privacy. We observed that the men themselves were depressed, lethargic, and were basically languishing in these cells. Aside from the 1 to 3 hours of allotted recreation, people basically sit in these cells for a majority of the day while they await their immigration hearings. And some of these men have been there for more than a year. The Polk facility is also located in a remote area in the city of Livingston, making it difficult, if not impossible, for loved ones and legal service providers to access. As a result, many men in the facility are isolated from the outside world. In addition, there's no programming in the Polk facility. When we asked the warden of Community Education Center, which operates the Polk County Detention Facility, whether they have any programs, they said they don't have any, but that they plan to allow men to purchase popsicle sticks from the commissary to make arts and crafts. If this is any indication of the lack of reflection of what kind of programs that they should provide for men, then many of these men in the detention facility are in grave danger. To give an example of the desperate situation that these men are in, 280 men signed up to speak with us about their experiences. When we met them, they were eager to tell their stories because they did not have any contact with the outside world for a long time. For example, one man who I interviewed was so happy to see me that he grabbed my hand and shook it vigorously. He told me that he did not have physical contact with someone from the outside for nearly a year. He told me that his wife and baby could not visit because they could not afford to travel the long distance to visit him. And this is the case for many people detained in the Polk County Detention Center. He told me it meant a lot to him that we were there to hear their stories. In our interviews in Polk, the men reported that they received poor and inadequate medical care because many of the medical staff actually don't speak Spanish. As a result, men told us stories about misdiagnoses, given wrong treatments, and sometimes even ignored. In the Houston Processing Center, the men and women reported that they suffer severe levels of stress, which studies have shown can contribute to health problems and shorten people's lives. They feel like they are treated like less than human in the facility, and they experience racist remarks and the staff. They experience racist remarks from the staff, and they constantly fear retaliation from security guards if they dare to speak up against any abuses. Men and women told us that the most difficult part about being in detention is being separated from their children, their husbands and wives, their families, and their communities. Women in the Houston Processing Center were nearly in tears when they explained to us how they were trying to preserve their families while being locked up in detention. I personally spoke to a man at the Houston Processing Center whose son, who is 9 years old, was sent to foster care because this man was sent to detention. Clearly, detention tears apart families and tears apart our communities. So on behalf of Texans United for Families, I submit these two reports to expose the conditions of these two facilities. We urge our local representatives in Texas to read the report, to conduct an investigation of these facilities, and to call for their immediate closure. Thank you.
Kim, my husband Najri Mustakim was detained abruptly without warning on March 30th of 2011 when federal immigration agents knocked on our door. My husband had a battle with addiction back in 2005, went through treatment in 2006, and has been celebrating a life of recovery ever since. Unfortunately, in 2007, when he went through his court hearing, his criminal lawyer did not advise him, based on his immigration status, how his plea bargain would affect his green card. He's been a permanent resident in the U.S. since he was 12. Since 1992, and so when he took this plea bargain, he didn't realize that he was basically giving away his ability to stay in the U.S. His case fell through the cracks, and it wasn't until 2011, 6 years later, where his case ended up on someone's desk. So they picked him up on March 30th, and we were told that he would bail out in a couple of hours, and that he'd be home, and he'd have an immigration hearing in a year or so. That didn't happen. It was a long, scary, humiliating, and powerless 10 months. We were told it'd be days, then weeks, then more weeks, then more weeks, and eventually turned into almost a year-long journey. And I say it's a journey because my husband was very fortunate. We had a lot of support from our community, our families, the faith community, and a lot of people that rallied around us, and my husband's case was eventually dropped because his criminal case was actually dropped due to lack of evidence on his original criminal case. So our story ended up a celebration, but along the way, as I visited him every 2 weeks at Pearsall, which is the South Texas Detention Complex, when I visited him, I'm a social work student at Baylor University, and from a social work standpoint, seeing these just human rights violations and just like a lack of consideration for family unity, the need for family closeness, and even contact visits. I've visited prisons before where contact visits were available, and to see people being held for civil offenses and to be treated as if they were violent threats to society and that they couldn't even hold their own children and their own wives, that provoked something in me as a future social worker, and just as also a person of faith. I saw a huge lack of compassion and just injustice all the way around. My husband was not at Polk, but he was fortunate enough to be somewhere that's considered among detainees, better than some of the other ones. But he also didn't receive adequate medical attention. Whenever he was sick, it was days, sometimes even a week before he saw a practitioner. Ibuprofen's their favorite thing to hand out for anything and everything, whether it's a bruised tailbone or a sinus infection. Legal access was very minimal when it came to people who really didn't know their own rights. They didn't have any connections with the outside world. They didn't have anyone advocating for them. And so having access to an attorney that would actually show up, that was very minimal. They were scared. Families didn't really know how to speak out or speak up. And so legal, medical, social, love, all that was just lacking. And for me, I knew when our journey would be over that we would need to speak up, because I, as an American citizen, never even knew that these detention centers even existed. And so we want to be a voice to call attention to not only that these for-profit detention centers exist, but that the conditions that these people are being held under are just oftentimes inhumane. They lack compassion. And we want to expose these 10 worst detention centers, but also call for reform in general to our detention and deportation policies, where someone who is not a threat to society, someone who is a contributing member to their community, to their family, that they would be able to remain with their families while awaiting the results of their civil case. So as a person who's actually been on the other side, just a little bit personally, finances are a family's finances are at risk. Our home was at risk. Our mortgage, my husband brought in most of the income. If it weren't for my family and friends, we would have lost our home. I would have had to cut my education at Baylor short. We would have lost everything and possibly had to start over in a new country that I've never even visited. And so we're very thankful for the results. But we are now going through family counseling for the trauma. My husband has post-traumatic stress symptoms, and we're believing for full recovery, but there are effects afterwards when you're being held in a detention center and you don't even understand why, and you thought this was over years ago. And so we really want to call for President Obama and our representatives to bring about some change in this system, because it doesn't have to be this way.
God is a word that some of us use to talk about our ultimate value. For some people that means the universal happiness of humankind. For other people that means personal happiness they can come from amassing as much profit as possible. These two values, these two ideas of worth have been at war since humankind began. And it is no surprise that our nation is currently locked in a struggle between those who advocate for human rights and those who advocate for property rights. The prophets were ordinary people like you and I, but they spoke about our common humanity. They spoke about what is an ultimate value. They spoke in the name of God, to say that a nation that values property and profit over people will surely die, because the universal principles that respect all human rights are the sinews that hold a nation together. A nation without that commitment to human rights is the spiritual equivalent to someone who has cancer. Without universal principles, a nation cannot hold together. The primary diagnostic tool used by the prophets to determine the health or sickness of a nation was how they treated the most vulnerable of their population. The poor, orphans, widows, but particularly the immigrant, the sojourner, the wanderer. The fact that we are now putting immigrants in prison, and in particular prisons that make a profit, is proof positive that we have lost our way, and that we consider persons without documentation to not be human at all, but as sources of revenue. There are those who you hear now saying that these private prisons will bring money to communities. But that's the same argument that was used for slavery. This nation has a long history from its inception of allowing the rich to enslave the poor, and it is no coincidence that the faces that we see in our prisons in the United States bear an eerie resemblance to the people who've been enslaved historically here, and to people from whom the land we stand on now was stolen. To have an economy that doesn't reckon the human toll, the human cost, is an apocalyptic sign for a nation. I'm no prophet, but I'm here to tell you that placing immigrant people in for-profit prisons is an apocalyptic sign of this nation. We cannot plunge to that level of inhumanity and return again to claim our universal principles. I'm here to tell you that in the name of our common humanity, in the name of that which we value most, in the name of God, we must shut these prisons for profit down. Thank you.
We are part of this campaign. The reports here in Texas are part of a larger picture of reports and 10 sites around the country. As you've heard, our immigration detention system is in crisis, and it has been growing and expanding over the years. President Obama promised and made a commitment to fundamentally change the system in 2009. But despite efforts over the last 3 years, as you've heard from speakers, the reality on the ground has not changed, and people continue to suffer conditions that are affront to human dignity. So Detention Watch Network members around the country gathered information about facilities around the country, and from their findings, they identified 10 facilities that are among the worst in the country. In addition to the 2 that are here in Texas, we also have facilities in Arizona, Alabama, California, Georgia, Illinois, Florida, New Jersey as well. And so the reports are being released today, and what you'll see is these facilities that the reports you're hearing about what's happening in Texas are not unique, that you're seeing a common pattern of abuse and deprivation and indignities of people suffered across the immigration detention system. We would also say that these 10 facilities are examples of what is problematic across the system overall. We believe that as Detention Watch Network members, we believe that we need fundamental change in the system. We are calling for closure of these 10 facilities as a first step. We believe that we call on President Obama and ICE to immediately terminate contracts with these 10 facilities. Further, in order for ICE to be able to enact the additional fundamental reforms that are needed, the government needs to end its dependency on the for-profit prison system and counties that are they're putting the profit motive over human lives. And further, Congress needs to end mandatory detention laws. But we believe that ending the contracts with these facilities are the first step. So thank you.
Well, thanks to all of our speakers, and again, I think everybody here is willing to answer questions individually, but again, I want to reiterate the fact that today we're releasing these reports, and we're also announcing the action on December 8th for International Human Rights Day at the Polk County Detention Center. So thanks for coming.